Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. Well, it's time for Harley Schlanger to talk to us about peace in Southwest Asia. Is it really happening? We'll start in 30 seconds. Welcome once again, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and today it's my pleasure to bring back to our show our every 2 weeks guest and commentator and just a wonderful, wonderful man to get some deep analysis of what's going on in the world, Mr. Harley Schlanger. Hi, Harley.
Hi, John. Good to see you.
Well, a lot going on. I titled the show today, Peace in Southwest Asia. Is it really possible?
Well, we'll have to see it. Let's just start by saying it's good that for the moment the killing seems to have been stopped. Although there was a final rampage by Israeli Defense Forces yesterday on their way out of town. The question of will it last? A lot of that has to do with whether President Trump stays focused. Because the problem is Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has made it clear that he's unhappy with the terms, although he'd like to put himself forward for the Nobel Peace Prize. And on the other side of it, you have much of the Arab world has been swung around to basically make a commitment, as they did at the Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt summit. What was it, 2 days ago? Where they said or yesterday. So they said they were interested in the Egyptian plan, which is a heavy funding plan to establish projects of economic development. That's the key. What Lyndon LaRouche has always said, a peace treaty is a piece of paper. A dam or a bridge that connects two different places, a rail system, a factory that produces goods that are used by both parties. That's how you get to peace. And so we'll see whether there's enough commitment to overcome the horrors of the last 2 years to have a lasting peace.
It's hard for me to believe, frankly. I saw all the celebrations on my Twitter feed and thought, wow, they're celebrating very early in this process. So I think you're right on when we say we'll have to wait and see, unfortunately. But, there's a number of questions that just linger. I guess one of them, to put it bluntly, is the off-sea oil and gas, the interests of people like Genie Energy and the port of Gaza. Who's going to control it? Or who's going to build it? And then, of course, the major question about water and what LaRouche organization has always promoted, the Oasis Plan. And I'm happy to have you give a thumbnail of that plan. Of course, it all goes back to Ben Gurion and Ben Gurion's original plan to bring water into the I was going to say Middle East, but let's say Southwest Asia concentrate population centers. So there's three things, oil and gas, the port, and the water system. And is there any clue as to what the Great Committee has in store for those big questions?
I don't think the Great Committee has been fully staffed yet. I don't think they've got a desk or an office. I think they have a certain amount of self-congratulations going on. But, this is I just wanted to say this at the beginning. You have all the people trying to take credit now for this. And I think we we should give some credit to Donald Trump that he did, however he did it, he twisted Netanyahu's arm. And Netanyahu is not happy. He's under enormous pressure. The caveat to that is, why did he wait so long? Why didn't he do this when he first came in? Now, secondly, I don't know if you saw this. I just read before we got on that Blinken is running around saying that Trump took the work that was done by the Biden administration, and that's what his peace plan came from. And it's that kind of loose talk that's could sink the Trump involvement in this, because the Biden was weak. He did nothing to pressure Netanyahu. Trump at least showed that he could use some force in it. So I would say, as a prelude before we get into the specifics, the question of the full plan is not yet seen, and that's because it's so difficult. They got a 20-point agreement, which many of the points are vague. For example, who's going to police the Gaza Strip? Who's going to reconstruct it? 75% of the buildings have been knocked down. The roads that exist have been torn up. The water system doesn't function. The sanitation system doesn't function. There are still armed gangs, and one of the armed gangs is a Islamic militant group that's funded by Israel to try to make sure that Hamas doesn't come back. So there are so many problems that I think the hope is that the sense of relief that the killing has stopped is going to carry the goodwill at least into another week or two. Now, then you have the whole question of accountability. Is anyone going to be held accountable for the maybe 100,000 Palestinians who have been killed? Will anyone be held accountable on the side of Hamas? Is there a possibility for reconciliation? And that's why LaRouche has always said you need to move the earth and get the joint projects going to incentivize peace, and that's really what has to start right away. So even before they fill out the plans and the boxes as who's going to do what and who will sit where, they really have to make a commitment to an economic plan. Now, at Sharm el-Sheikh, at the summit that was hosted by President al-Sisi of Egypt on Monday, there were vague discussions about pledges of money. There were 22, I think, heads of state who were there. And, some of the pledges are kind of weak, very small. For example, what can Macron offer? He has his government's in a shambles. I think Starmer said that they could come up with a couple $100 million. Why don't they take the money that they're planning, the Europeans, that they're planning to deploy to go to war against Russia, and put it to work building up a joint economic development perspective for the Middle East?
Why, indeed. Well, I mean, we could turn to the Russia-Ukraine situation and dig into that now if you want. But I still want to talk about the. Well, I had a kind of a global question I wanted to ask you, just generally about Israel, and that is, you and I have been saying for many shows for years now that. Israel is ultimately a British intelligence project, if I can put it that way. And my question is, how do they maintain control over Israel when it appears to be Israel, has the Mossad, it has this incredible network, AIPAC and ADL and all over American government and institutions around the world that have tentacles everywhere. I object to the idea of blaming everything on Israel. I think it's important that we maintain the lines that go back to the source. And so generally, I was kind of baffled as to how they were going to do it until I heard the name Tony Blair come in.
A dead giveaway, huh?
Well, I thought, oh my God. I mean,
Well, I mean, there are other names you could turn to also. Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6. But let me get back to the point you were raising about the Mossad and how Israel functions. They couldn't do that without a go-ahead from the United States and Britain. And when we're talking about the British control, the ideology behind it is British. But the British have co-opted leading elements of US intelligence and US corporations to work with them. And so it's not just a question of Britain, although the place to start is how the British Empire set this whole thing up. Going back to the end of the 19th century, the idea of geopolitics in the early part of the 20th century, the British mandate from the League of Nations over Palestine, and then the British role continuing to control both elements of the radical settler movement, the Zionist movement, as well as radical Islam. Now, when you look at the situation in Israel, what is it that's been driving the Netanyahu regime the last 20 years? It's hostility to Iran, hostility to the neighbors. But why? Well, because there are people in those countries who do march on the streets and chant death to Israel. The question is, what has been done to try and get an understanding as to why that's the case? And what you'll find is that the radical Islam is a product of British intelligence. You look at for example, the new government in Syria. I'm told from Vanessa Beeley, who's one of the best reporters who was in Syria until she had to flee recently, that there were MI6 people and British Special Services people all over the place working together with what used to be the offshoot of Al-Qaeda that took over Syria. Now, are they continuing to threaten Israel? Are they going to try and get in an alliance with Israel? Are they going to continue to run Islamic terrorist movements in the Middle East? That's one area where the British are involved because they have the assets and the capability to run these counter-gang operations. Secondly, money. Israel's economy is largely dependent on its integration with especially now, the military defense tech sector of the British. And the British are using their corporate control over the European Union and Israel to open the door for contracts for all sorts of things. And one example of that, TikTok. What just happened with TikTok?
mm-hmm.
I just wrote a short article on this for our briefing today. You have this guy, Larry Ellison, who for a brief period of time was worth more than Elon Musk, something like $345 billion personal wealth. Now, how did that happen? Contracts within the tech sector, back and forth with NVIDIA, with all the AI companies. Oracle got over $100 billion of contracts in the last year, which gave them enough cash they could do what they want. And so they, among the other things, they took over Paramount, which is a major US entertainment company, which gives them control of CBS. They're targeting X. They're targeting CNN. Now, who's Larry Ellison? He's a hardcore Zionist, an old friend of Netanyahu and Trump. He's one of the leading figures in the Friends of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. And so when we talk about the British, we're talking about this integrated military defense, now tech sector. And we saw that with the event in London in Windsor Castle that King Charles held for Trump. Who was there? We didn't see the usual assortment of celebrities like Mr. Bean and Judith Dench. Who did we see? Tech execs. And $42 billion in contracts were drafted there. So you get someone like Ellison, and what's his role? Well, the day after Netanyahu's tragic appearance at the United Nations, where the hall emptied out in opposition to him. And he gave a clownish speech that's probably in the Hall of Fame next to Hegseth's recent speech, where he just ranted and raved against everybody. And then he went into a meeting at the New York City Israeli consulate office. And there he met with American influencers, who are media personalities who are on US podcasts and news all the time. And in Netanyahu's speech, he said, look, we have a new battlefield. The new battlefield is the one where Americans are scrolling on X, on TikTok. And he said there's a convergence of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So we're going to address this. And how are we going to do it? And he said, TikTok. And they're focused especially on TikTok because of its wide reach into the young population in the United States. And they say TikTok is filled with anti-Semitic memes. Now, if you actually go on TikTok, what you find is they have a lot of different things, including people talking about whether or not Israel is committing genocide in Palestine. That's no longer going to happen because Ellison took it over to make sure there's no anti-Israel or anti-Zionist message. And so how is that? Now you could say, well, is that Israel controlling the United States? Well, they're doing it through this broader British hybrid warfare strategy of control the narrative, censorship, and what we see now from Oracle and its position at the top, and moving in increasingly to take over not only the legacy media, but the whole realm of what is I'm looking for the word, the
Mainstream media?
not the mainstream, the podcast universe.
You mean me?
Yeah. And is it Israeli intelligence or British intelligence that might give you a strike on YouTube? Well,
I got one last week, by the way.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
And where do they come from? Now here's the other thing about how this thing worked with TikTok. You had American imbecilic, the native species of Doomkoffs, the Congress, saying that China is using TikTok to gather metadata on American citizens. So we have to take it away from them. They're sneaking in and subverting the youth. So what do? They force TikTok to sell, and it's directed to a consortium headed by Oracle's Ellison and his son. And now what does it mean? It means the metadata of the 180 million Americans who use TikTok will now be in the hands of the Israelis instead of the Chinese. And I would argue that in the hands of the radical Zionists, that may be more dangerous for the United States. So that's how this British thing works. It's not that someone's sitting in an office in London calling Netanyahu saying, Bibi, now go bomb Iran. He gets enough of that influence coming from the US and Britain. But it's through these other kinds of channels, especially financial and defense-related channels, that the policy is written.
Oil and gas. I think my sense is that oil and gas is still the major issue in the world, and the wars are about resources generally, but specifically how important oil and gas is. The Ukrainians often talk about how the Russia is going to run out of oil and gas, and this is how the wars are fueled. This is how the ships run. This is how the economy works. And so we talked about the foreign policy, the Five Eyes, the Mossad, and all. But aren't they all basically there to keep the oil and gas running so as to profit the already elite people who maybe didn't get invited to the tech meeting, but still own a great deal of the tech industry.
Well, I wouldn't minimize the importance of oil and gas, because in the middle of the last century, you had Royal Dutch Shell, you had British Petroleum, you had Standard Oil. They were the biggest players in the Southwest Asia. But you have something new that's coming, which is, and I say I don't want to minimize it, because for the short term, if they can find new pools of oil and gas, and they do say the area off the Gaza coast is fairly promising for rich deposits. But here's something new. The Middle East, so-called as a whole, is transitioning away from fossil fuel. The Saudis are talking about working with China and Russia to build modular nuclear reactors, these small reactors that do not go through a uranium weapons cycle. This is going to be the future. Now, in the short term, they'll exploit the resources they have, but the Russians and the Chinese are also moving very rapidly, not only toward existing fossil fission technologies, but they're developing fusion. So they have a different perspective. Now, the oil companies will do what they can to get access to oil, and the cheaper the oil for them, the better their profits will be. So I'm not trying to minimize it completely, but if you're going to have a future policy for that region, or for Africa, because look, the raw materials found in Africa are still huge resources, and they're going to be developed by the African countries. Now, are they going to do it with coal and wood? They're going to do it with oil and gas, probably oil and gas. But the African countries themselves are saying, why can't we have a nuclear fuel cycle? So the question is, do we stick in the old paradigm where oil and gas is not only the basis of all electricity production and so on, but it's also the justification for war and for coups and revolutions? Or do we move to some different level of the productive use of materials for production of electricity? Now, this comes up, it's interesting, John, that you brought it up, because I was just looking at these statistics that were put out by the IFO Institute, which is the leading German economic institute, on Germany. And Germany had an 18% drop in auto sales from last year to this year, a 24% drop in sales of heavy truck and construction equipment. And the auto sector is collapsing in Germany. Now, it's not that people don't want cars, but that because of the loss of cheap energy with the cutoff of Russian oil and gas, the prices of the production have gone up in Germany. So there is an interconnection here that you're talking about. But I think in the future, we're not going to have wars in Southwest Asia over control of oil and gas. But the question is, will they be allowed to develop the full nuclear fuel cycle for the electricity production? And that's also key to water, because desalination, you can do a certain amount of desalination. If you go back to what LaRouche proposed with the Oasis Plan, you have canals that connect the various rivers, the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, and along these canals, you can have a certain amount of hydroelectric capability, because it takes a lot of electricity to desalinate water. But if you build these modular nuclear reactors, voila, you have the electricity you need for modernizing the living circumstances of the cities and towns and so on, but also the electricity you need to desalinate the water. And so this is the shift in paradigm based on the classic example of what LaRouche calls the Hamiltonian system, which is the improvement in the productive powers of labor by scientific discovery and then application of technologies that come from those scientific discoveries. So it's where science meets politics meets economics that you will see the future, as opposed to the British model, which is you suppress technologies, you make people dependent on increasingly scarce resources, and then you have the basis for wars.
You know, I have to say, my dear friend Corky Goss has got to be screaming Yahoo when you speak of the nuclear fusion as a upcoming power source, and it makes a lot of sense, especially the small nuclear reactors that do not engage in the fuel process, the nuclear
weapons grade uranium
weapons
production.
grade.
Yeah.
So, and this is something, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I guess it was Warren Buffett that is investing in what was called a uranium fuel bank. And I think this appears to exist in Kazakhstan, where he collects nuclear fuel rods or something. I'm not sure what it is, but this is old to me, but I haven't heard about it in a long time. So this development is going on in Asia, and particularly, I suspect, in China behind the scenes. I don't think Russia is very well equipped to develop nuclear fuel reactors at this time. It's my understanding they've
actually, John, they are.
really.
Yeah, Rosatom, the Russian nuclear company, just signed a contract with some of the formerly French West African countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, because there's a lot of uranium there. And you have these poor countries that were French colonies and were exporting all their uranium to France, where 75% of electricity comes from uranium, which is why France is not having the same kind of economic catastrophe as Germany. And these countries are now saying, why were we producing all this uranium for you when we get our energy from burning brush? So this is part of the new paradigm. And I think if you read what is said about China, the fear about China is that if China is successful in this integrated connectivity of the Belt and Road Initiative of transport, energy production, water and power management, as I said, you get away from the scarcity and this idea that we're going to run out of resources, we're all going to end up eating each other, and you begin to see the world in a whole new way. And what's the key to it? Human creativity and statecraft, which is based on the principle that it's a successful state depends on the full maximum development of its population, of the creative powers of its population, instead of the crap culture that we have in the West, the degeneration. To me, one of the models of this was the opening of the Paris Olympics. This completely horrible. Yeah. And what is the view of man in the West is as a predator, as, get your pleasure however you can and stay out of trouble. And the founding fathers started with the conception of Plato, that wealth comes from the development of the human mind. And the human mind is developed through a process of hypothesis. And the hypothesis means that you're not stuck with the senses, but you have the capacity to think outside of what you see, smell, hear, and so on. And that's the difference between British philosophical radicalism, as it's called, the Sir Francis Bacon, or the ethics of Hobbes and Locke, versus what the Germans developed around Riemann and Einstein, what the U.S. developed in terms of the ingenuity, being able to turn ideas into new machines. That's the difference between the old world, which is collapsing, which is the British world, and the potential for a new paradigm based on science and creativity and mutual benefit. Mutual benefit, the Christian idea.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say Nicholas of Cusa at this point, because that ties it all together very well. I just read a portion of James M. Carroll's book, Constantine's Sword, in which he discusses Nicholas of Cusa and how important that first idea of recognizing that God is not restricted to any one religion, and that universality of humanity that got buried quickly right after him, but is and that is still our state right now. I'm hearing you speak, and I'm thinking, where in the United States is anybody saying this? Nobody is. There's no politician. There's no academic leaders. There's no business leaders. There's nobody in the, I think America is still worried about the Homer Simpson problem of, this Homer from The Simpsons kicking his feet back and eating donuts while the nuclear plant is going into meltdown. Really, I mean, that's the image that I still have. And I think most people in this country. And then, of course, I have to say that it might be at least 50 years ago that I first got my first little sticker that said Atomkraft, Nein Danke. The Germans were very, very much against atomic power. So, but I was also, one more thing, and I'll give it back to you, Neil deGrasse Tyson. On a quick little, I hate to look at him, but he was in my face one time on a Facebook reel, and he said, "Oh yeah, we do have nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs exist. They just don't emit radiation anymore. We got rid of that." Oh man, what is this guy talking about? But back to the political problem here in this country is, it's just phenomenal how many layers of crap you have to dig under before you get to the real question of energy. And yeah, it is about how much do I have to put in my car at the gas station? How much is the gas? Is it $3.50? Is it $4 a gallon? And who's going to keep my gas price down? Teslas, we're seeing more and more of them, but I would say it's still less than 5% of the vehicles that I see on the road. So America may be sneaking into this small nuclear reactor business without anybody knowing it. You have any hints? I mean, who in America is leading this?
Well, I would say we are. We are.
Yeah.
We set up something years ago called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And before the prosecution of LaRouche took off, we had 125,000 subscribers to our Fusion magazine. And these included many people in state legislatures. We had, I think, 12 state legislatures, which passed a memorial to the Congress calling for full funding of nuclear fusion. This was in 1982, the McCormick Bill. And at that time, you see, going back to this question of the British, the idea of progress is what characterizes the best part of civilization, Western and Eastern. And the idea that progress comes from the free will of man to advance creative discoveries. And the problem has been, how do you have states that organize themselves that way to increase their productive value? Instead, people get fixated on money, possessions.
Sure.
And so we had, because of the Hamiltonian system, an idea that, and we see this now with the debate going on over the shutting down of government. Why do we keep running up to a debt limit? I mean, are we not smart enough to realize that if you're going to spend more than you're producing, you're going to end up in trouble, and you're going to either have inflation or a hyperinflationary blowout?
Nope.
Well, the point is that the Hamiltonian system had a slightly different view of credit. And Hamilton said, a well-managed national debt is a blessing because it means people will trust you to join in investments in the expectation that they'll get a return. But what happens when you have an unwell managed, to use a awkward phrase, policy towards debt, where you say, well, if I can't afford it, I can always borrow. And if I can't cover it, someone else will cover it, or I'll have to go through bankruptcy. Well, we had a system that worked. And that's what was the fight, the central fight between the American system and the British system was this idea of the nature of man. Is man just a consumer? Or is man capable of constantly transforming society based on new creative ideas? And if you look at the British, I mentioned before, British philosophical radicalism, Hume, Locke, Hobbes, Bacon, all of whom Trump praised in his speech at King Charles' banquet, probably not knowing the full implications of that. These were all people who were empiricists and pessimists. And so the best of them might be Locke, who said, well, you need a contract, government based on contract, so that people can balance out their personal interests. Hobbes was more direct. He said, you have beasts, humans are beasts, and you need a leviathan, you need a power over above them to pound them into some kind of order. But the founding fathers basically gave individual freedom as the basis by which you can have a well-managed economy. And you can constantly make new discoveries because, the other person I didn't mention is Malthus, who said that food supply will always grow less fast than population. And so he looked at mankind like a bunch of rabbits. What rabbits will do is they'll grow in number until there are too many of them for the available food that they have. And he said that's the same with human beings, the Malthusian conundrum. Well, we've disproved that over and over and over, that advances in agricultural technology, and in particular, the British physiocratic doctrine doesn't like the idea of application of industry to agriculture because they say you're taking away from what's needed by building the industry. But who can argue against modern agricultural technology, leaving aside GMOs and things like that? So this idea that we're never going to have resource shortages provided we have a credit system that functions to inspire investment in new technologies, research and development. But what do we have today? Companies are so strapped, the major corporations so strapped to pay their debts, they cut back research and development. That's the first thing they cut. And so they're stuck doing the same thing over and over and over. And with any resource, if you don't expand the resource capability of the production process, it's also ultimately limited. So now this is a long way of getting to your initial question. How do the British control something like Israel? It's through philosophy, through control of intelligence and communications. And now we're seeing, I would argue that this new deal with Oracle moving in on the social media and the legacy media, it's part of a new step forward by big tech to limit the kind of freedom of expression that's necessary for this kind of creative development of society. So this is a turning point. And we could use the developments in Southwest Asia as a proof of principle that the way out of these kinds of conflicts is cooperation and technological development. That's what the Oasis Plan is about. It's true, there's not fresh water in most of that area. You fly above it and what you see is desert as far as the eye can see. Of course, the same thing's true of the Southwest of the United States. What changes that is policies that allow for desalination. which requires a lot of electricity. But we know how to do it. But where's our electricity going now? It's going into these AI data centers. So, we've got the wrong paradigm, the wrong sense of the image of man, and that's how the British control things.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can we have all these things without digital ID? I think that's where they will say no. You can't have nice things unless we have your data, unless we are able to give you a social credit score and make sure you don't complain about our policy, or for heaven's sake say the words Palestinian action. We'll lock you up. And so you got to get with the program if you want to have all the nice stuff that we're developing behind the scenes. It's creepy.
Well, they limit choices.
Yeah.
They say your choice is either you're going to pay more for fuel or you have green policy and you don't drive. Now, why can't we develop more efficient ways of transport? And there are there. The Chinese have something like 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. And some of my associates just got back from another conference in China. And they said that from Guangdong to Shanghai, 10 years ago when they were there, it took 4 hours by train. They made it in 40 minutes this time. And they say that you don't even know you're traveling. It's at 500 kilometers per hour speeds. A high-speed train in the United States gets from Baltimore to Washington in about 3 days.
Yeah.
So, and this is why our country's going to hell. Now, Germany, which had a rapid technological advance after the fall of, after the defeat of the Nazis, the economic miracle was a brilliant economic policy, an American-style credit policy through the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the credit institution for economic development. And that's being shut down with this idea that everything has to be privatized. And if you privatize it, who benefits? BlackRock, Vanguard, JP Morgan Chase. I just saw a video the other day of Jamie Dimon. It was from 2 months ago, the chairman, CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He said, we're about to have a $141 trillion meltdown of the bond markets.
Mm.
And he said in 2007, it was about 14 trillion bonds that went up into smoke. So he's saying it's going to be 10 times larger. And then what he said next was astounding, with a smile on his face. He said, and this is at an investors conference, he said, this is going to panic you, and it should. Not me. We're positioned to make money on it. Now, that's the system that our founding fathers fought against, which puts private interest above the general welfare. These are really kind of simple concepts, John, as you know, as sort of a guy who remembers a better time in our history. But we also know that better time was used by enemies of the American system for personal private benefit. And we've got to claw back at that, take back our country, and have citizens who are capable of expressing the kind of ideas we're discussing today about what is the real nature of wealth, what is the nature of man. Are we limited to fixed resources? Because if we are, any amount of resources that we have will run out of.
I think that that is the reason why we have this war in Ukraine that keeps being it just keeps going on and on and on, and the guys keep dying, and the arms makers keep getting more money, and the politicians keep getting more campaign contributions to make sure that the arms makers keep getting more money. And the policy of that empire and the Israeli participation in it is just everywhere. It just keeps on growing and growing. And so I think that's the answer to your question is, well, we've got this incredible debt coming up that at some point we're going to go broke, but they're going to say, no, we're not going to go broke. We're just going to take more stuff from other people. And we're going to use inflation, use taxation, use everything we need to make sure that it keeps floating. It's going to keep on floating forever. Just like Elon Musk is going to take us to Mars, and we're going to mining the satellites. We're going to be getting gold from these rocks out there that are just sitting there, and all we got to do is get the spaceship there, and we're going to be the masters of the universe. So don't worry about the debt, Harley. Come on.
Well, I have a slightly different view of that. I think that this idea of the extraterrestrial imperative, the idea that we need to go out into space, is part of the triggering process of inspiration to develop new ideas. Because you're challenging what seem to be fixed laws, that namely human beings can't travel in space. Well, why not? What can we learn? What did we learn from NASA? Was NASA a huge waste of money? I mean, some people today now say it was all a fraud. We never went to the moon. And, that's part of the pessimism. But look what we actually learned from the brief 15 years of the best period of NASA in terms of medical technology. Computers were just triggered into a whole new world by the need for advanced computation in the split second. So we need these challenges. Now, Musk may turn it into a personal ego thing, but that's not necessarily the reason not to do something. This is why you have representative governments in countries where people can make these choices, but you have to have people who are capable of thinking about what the choices represent. I mean, there are reasons you can disagree about all sorts of things. For example, can you trust Hamas? Can you trust Netanyahu? The answer in both is probably no. So the question is, what do you do about it? Well, who has the capability to change the behavior of such networks as so-called terrorists or war criminals like Netanyahu? Well, the United States does. Russia does. But the British try to keep the US and Russia apart. Now we've got this crisis here in Europe. Are we going to give the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine so they can shoot missiles and targets deep inside Russia? And Tomahawks also can be nuclear capable. So if we start shooting those missiles into Russia, what if a Russian surveillance team suspects that there are nuclear capable weapons on the Tomahawk? Then humanity is gone. So can't you sit back for a minute and realize there's nothing good that's going to come out of this Ukraine war? And that that Putin should be taken seriously when he says the reason for the war was the existential threat to the security of Russia from eastward motion of NATO. Why is that considered Putin looking for war? So this is where we have to fight these narratives every single day. And it helps, John, to be able to talk to someone like you who has been studying this and looking at its history and can identify what are the private interests that have taken over and perverted us from pursuing the general welfare. Now, as I say, we can debate what would be the general welfare. How much money should we spend on fusion research? How much do we need to spend on high-speed rail? What are the areas that are most needed for recruitment of young people into careers? These are things we can debate and discuss, but we're not doing that. We're just trying to figure out how can you make enough money to retire and have enough to live till you die.
Yeah, that's true, and it's sad. That I feel like I'm one of the really the most fortunate people alive today because I was the benefit of a tremendous education. Looking back on it, I have this, you know, I all the way back to my first Latin class, where Brother Paul Malik would walk up and down the hall and say "Amo amasamat," and if you didn't say "Amo amasamat," you're going to get the ruler on the wrist.
Oh yeah.
So I really do value the idea of everyone should have such an experience in education as I've had. I've been very, very lucky. And so it stimulates the brain to think about these things. And, when you,
But you're also lucky, John, because you continue to have that thirst for knowledge as opposed to settling, as
yeah,
opposed to saying I'm comfortable and I'm not going to concern myself with justice for all mankind.
oh my God. Yeah. The other day on my Facebook page, I said, I was complaining about the genocide, and somebody, a person I respect very much, just said, "Well, that's above my pay grade." And I said, "Oh my, this is not the way you're supposed to exercise your citizenship in this country. You're supposed to take a look at these challenges, and perhaps you might, after looking at it, say, well, you know what, I guess there's nothing I can do about it." But don't just say it's above my pay grade. That's like you saying, "Oh, all I'm focused on is my retirement, my children, my car." You know, it's sad.
And that leads to what's known as entropy, which is no solution. You're trapped in a box, and eventually, your life has no meaning.
Yeah,
I mean, I have a sense. I became a father rather late in life, but I always appreciated the idea of people having children, having an urge to make sure there's something better for their children, because that's what I learned from my parents and my grandparents. And for people who are saying, "Look, you've got to take care of yourself," to their kids, "We're just going to take care of ourselves."
right.
Um, that's somewhat a typical baby boomer mentality, but it's an infection of moral degeneration in the form of pessimism. And pessimism is basically giving up on the human mind.
Well, this is why I am so passionate about our campaign to undo the coup here at Macduff Lives. And I do hope people around the country and the world will take up this idea, because as I was showing yesterday on the show, the polls show that both Republicans and Democrats, right wing, left wing, conservative, liberal, the majority by far does not believe the Warren Commission and wants to know the truth about JFK. The ones that don't are suffering from that pessimism that you just mentioned, and that we're not going to find out, so just let it go. I can't do that, and that's because of my particular place, growing up in that era, and my father, and the sudden exit of my father from our lives has always been haunting me. So that's why I keep working on it as a personal drive, is to understand what was really going on in the Pentagon in 1962, 63. What did people know? Who was plotting? And then again, the fact is that it has cast a shadow over us, both psychologically, as what Peter Dale Scott calls a structural deep event, like 9/11. It's one of those dystopic things that if you don't know what happened, it's going to always drag you down. It's going to make you feel like
And these
things
and
out.
these events are organized to have that effect.
Yeah,
That's the strategy of tension. If
yeah,
you're sitting around thinking there are irrational people who want to blow me up, so I better stay away from them,
yeah,
you give up the passion for justice. You give up on the love of your fellow man. And it's so ironic to see people like Hegseth, who claim to be devout Christians,
yeah,
who speak in such bizarre terms about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he's pretty much a sidekick of Itamar Ben-Gvir, basically saying that they're going to use the Temple Mount to bring back Jesus, by having a Holocaust in the case of Ben-Gvir of all the Muslims, or in the case of Hegseth of all the non-Christians. That's going to bring back Jesus. Where are they getting this theology? The British. We keep coming back to that. And that's how hybrid warfare works. You're not aware that your limited choices are causing you to make bad decisions. And that's how censorship works.
And that is the Leviathan, isn't it? That's Hobbes's Leviathan that's sitting in the city of London, telling everybody, here's how far you can go, and don't rock the boat, and make sure the 10% comes up to the big guy every day. And if we need to fix things, we'll just fudge the numbers at the LIBOR exchange, and we'll fix everything. Or
in the meantime, let's have a military buildup because Putin's coming to get us. And what's your evidence of that? They don't have it. They manufacture it. The so-called drone attacks. Where are these drones coming from? How can we be so certain that we need a drone wall to replace the old Berlin Wall to keep the Russians out of Western Europe?
But I think that this goes all the way back to 1947, and then when Eisenhower's elected, we have the Dulles brothers running everything behind the scenes, and we all become convinced. And I think even the diplomats were convinced that the Soviet Union was a existential threat to Europe and the United States, and they acted that way. They believed it. I think in their hearts they really believed that if they didn't do this thing, that the Soviets were going to take over everything. And when will they ever learn? As Bob Dylan says, when will they ever learn? It's wrong. It's just wrong.
Well, what would be interesting for people as a thought experiment would be to look at George Kennan when he first authored the idea of the containment, and then look at him at the end of his life saying NATO expansion is stupid. It's dangerous. Sometimes you can learn from looking at the people who come up with the bad policies and change, because it shows you that they are capable of changing. And that's what's most necessary right now, is for people to be willing to challenge the way they think, the axioms that they have, in the interests of a better future. And I think that's probably good place to leave our discussion today, because if you look at what we're facing, we started by saying we don't know what's going to happen in Southwest Asia. An hour later, we still don't know, but I think we explored certain pathways that could give us a better answer.
Well, Harley, with your depth of experience and I just love talking to you, and looking forward already to the next time. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for your willingness to participate with us here at Macduff Lives. Harley Schlanger, the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. Check them out if you haven't, guys. It's great stuff. Bye now.